We are told constantly that reading is dying, and that attention spans have collapsed, and that story has lost its grip on us. And a generation raised on short form video has simply forgotten how to sit with a book. And if that were true, it would be worth grieving. Because reading is one of the greatest mediums that we have ever built for transmitting complexity and holding difficult ideas long enough to actually think them through. But there is a reason to be suspicious of this story before we accept it. Because the evidence does not actually point to a dying love of narrative per se. It actually points to something more narrow and more solvable, that we have not stopped loving stories. Instead, we have been taught to be ashamed of the stories that we love. Consider what has actually happened to reading in the last few decades. It has actually never been more accessible. We have audiobooks in our pockets, free libraries with vast digital categories, entire literary traditions available for nothing more than an internet connection. By any reasonable measure, the barrier to entry for story has never been lower. And yet, enjoyment in stories is falling. Recent research from the National Literacy Trust found that only about a third of young people between 8 and 18 say they enjoy reading in their free time, a number that has significantly dropped over time. Now, that same body of research found enjoyment rises again when reading matches personal taste, when it is chosen freely rather than assigned as some kind of moral obligation to society or oneself. So the raw appetite for story has not vanished, and I personally believe that it never will. Now, part of what has soured this relationship is the reader. Not you personally or even me, but someone that Joe Foley separates into an entirely different category. Now, the reader is used to distinguish this identity from the humble fact of simply being someone who happens to read. For the reader, reading is not something that one just does. It's something that one is. It essentially becomes a badge or a status symbol with which to measure another person's worth. The reader will recite a list of difficult books as though the list itself constitutes a personality. The reader has no patience for genre, no interest in what might actually delight another person, only a rigid hierarchy in which classics sit at the top and everything else, like fantasy, romance, or anything with a dragon or a happily ever after, is treated as a kind of embarrassing lesser cousin to real literature. And crucially, the reader is not simply annoying. The reader does active damage to the culture of reading itself, because the reader is often the first and loudest voice a young person hears when they pick up a book that isn't approved of. Now, this is not a new complaint. Michel de Montaigne, writing in the 16th century, aimed an entire essay at exactly this kind of figure. In Of Pentagree, he described the products of a rigorous classical education who emerged not humbled by their exposure to genius, but instead somehow inflated by it, as though simply having read Cicero or Plato transferred some of that genius directly into their own character. His target was the person who mistakes proximity to great books for the possession of actual wisdom. And there is a version of this same pedantry alive today. It shows up whenever someone insists that a book must come from the right shelf, in the right format, discussed in the right tone, before it is allowed to actually count as a book. It shows up when audiobooks are dismissed as not real reading, and when fantasy is treated as a guilty pleasure rather than a legitimate mode of storytelling. The entire experience of reading becomes about proving something to an invisible panel of judges rather than about the pleasure of the story itself. His insight was that this kind of performance produces exactly the opposite of what education is supposed to produce. Instead of humility and curiosity, we get arrogance and gatekeeping. And gatekeeping, whatever its intentions, tends to shrink the audience rather than elevate it, hence the term. Now, C.S. Lewis also offers something to this argument. In his short but remarkable book, An Experiment in Criticism, Lewis makes an argument so simple. He suggests that we have been asking the wrong questions entirely. Instead of asking whether a book is good literature, we should be asking what kind of reading is happening when someone opens it. For Lewis, a good reading is one in which the self is temporarily set aside, in which the reader surrenders attention fully to another mind, another world, and another way of seeing reality. And critically, he insists that this experience of surrender and being enlarged by a story can happen just as easily with the fairy tale or detective novel as it can with the most celebrated works of the literary canon. The measure was never the genre, because there are many, many texts that are considered fantasy or romance that we consider works of literary genius today. But the measure was always the quality of attention that it brought to the page. This single reframing dissolves an enormous amount of that shame that surrounds reading for pleasure. A person absorbed completely in a fantasy novel, and who is moved by its characters, changed a little by having lived inside of its world for a few hundred pages. And that does not mean that they are doing a lesser version of reading. According to Lewis, they actually may be doing reading in its truest form. And this matters enormously for the case of fantasy and romance specifically, genres that are so often treated as the bottom rung of the status ladder that should essentially not exist in the first place. Now, these are not simple genres. Fantasy, in particular, has always been a vehicle for working through questions that are very difficult to approach directly. Questions about power and depression, loyalty, what we owe to each other, and what kind of person we become under real pressure. And romance, for its part, is frequently dismissed as fluff, precisely because it centers emotional and rational life, as though the inner architecture of intimacy and commitment were somehow less worthy of serious attention than a battle scene or a courtroom drama. But there is a case to be made, and philosopher Martha Nussbaum has made a version of it across much of her work, that literature's deepest value lies not in its difficulty, but its capacity to build moral imagination. Fiction lets us rehearse being somebody else. It lets us feel, from the inside, what a different set of circumstances might do to a person's choices and character. Now, this is not a function reserved for difficult canonical texts. A well-drawn fantasy world grappling with injustice can do this just as well, and a well-written romance grappling with vulnerability and trust can do this work. The genre is not the determining factor. It is the depth of the engagement in the story. So why does shame persist in the society? Well, part of the answer lies in a broader tendency that we have. We like to sort people into fixed categories, as though identity were a stable inner essence, rather than a pattern of behavior that shifts and grows over time with the person. And we do this with reading when we ask if someone is a real reader, as though there exists some essential reader-ness, separate from the actual ordinary act of just picking up a book and turning its pages. And we do the same thing when we ask if somebody is a math person or a science person, as though these are fixed qualities rather than largely a matter of practice and encouragement. In both cases, the identity talk becomes a trap. It tells people implicitly that they either belong to a category or they don't, and there is little point in trying. Now, this is precisely backwards. Reading, just like with most human skills, responds to practice, interest, and the freedom to engage with the material that actually resonates. Turning it into a fixed identity, gated by a narrow definition of what counts, does not raise the standard of reading in our culture. It simply narrows who feels invited to participate at all. Now, none of this is an argument that all reading is equally demanding, or that there is no room for difficulty, and that we should never stretch ourselves towards a book that challenges us, because there is real value in encountering ideas that resist easy understanding, and there is something to be said for building the patience and stamina that difficult texts require. But the audiobook, fantasy paperback, or romance novel that's dog-eared on your nightstand are not the enemy of that deeper engagement. They are very often the doorway to it. A person who falls in love with a story through an accessible and pleasurable book is a person far more likely to eventually seek out something more demanding, precisely because they have learned that reading can be a source of genuine delight, rather than an obligation performed for an audience. The real crisis in reading is not a crisis of laziness or shortened attention spans, but instead a crisis of permission. We have built a culture that essentially tells us our reading only counts if it looks a certain way, sounds a certain way, and impresses the right people. When you strip that away, what remains is something much simpler and harder to kill. A species that has always loved stories, whether it's through the oral tradition or by actually reading it. The reader as an identity to be earned and defended may well be dying, but reading itself, freed from that identity, might finally have the room to live if it does. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see y'all next time.